Good evening and thanks for joining us on this Friday night. State Representative Jason Dockter was found guilty today of voting on past legislation that he had a financial interest in. Justin Gick reports on the one-day trial.
As the guilty verdict was read, a look of disappointment fell across the defense. Earlier in the day, lawyers called witnesses to bolster their cases. Defense lawyer Lloyd Sirr said Dockter did nothing wrong and that conflicts can arise in the legislature. Sirr said Dockter followed House Rule 321.
So under the House rules and the Senate rules for that matter, a legislator may still vote without problem, as long as they have no interest in it that is direct, individual, unique, and substantial.
Ladd Erickson, the state's attorney, contended that Dockter was involved in the lease of a building in South Bismarck that he was part owner of to the Attorney General's office and the North Dakota Department of Health. Erickson said that appropriations bills came in for these two entities that had the lease, and Dockter didn't recuse himself from voting.
And in 2021 votes on both appropriations, even though he had already acquired a pecuniary interest in this property, benefiting by, if you look at the definitions, an official action is a vote. Voting on something that benefits you privately.
The state used an episode of Rob Port's Plain Talk podcast as one piece of evidence where Dockter talked about a state audit that took place on the Attorney General's office space. The state also called multiple witnesses, including State Auditor Josh Gallion and John Bjornson, the Director of Legislative Counsel. The defense called two witnesses that included BCI Director Lonnie Grabowska and State Representative Emily O'Brien of Grand Forks. Dockter then took the stand to testify.
You know, we have these House rules and we shall vote. And we can stand up and say we have a conflict, but it has to be very specific. And I just felt it wasn't direct, it's really unique and substantial.
The jury deliberated for almost 2 hours. District Judge Bobby Weiler will sentence Dockter at a later date. In Bismarck, I'm Justin Gick reporting for your news leader.
Dockter faces a maximum penalty of imprisonment for 360 days, a fine of $3,000, or both. Now, in the wake of that verdict, state Democrats called for Dockter to resign, with House Minority Leader Zach Ista saying, in part, he has the right to appeal his conviction, but he should step aside from the privilege of serving in the legislature. All North Dakotans deserve elected officials who are acting only in the best interest of the citizens of our great state.